Welcome to the 25th anniversary edition of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. We remind ourselves that we are running this festival as climate catastrophes multiply and intensify, when over 6 million people worldwide have died from COVID, and when the people of Ukraine are fighting the brutal Russian invasion. For all of us at FLEF, the world is our why. I'm Anne Michelle, producer of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. Major sponsors for FLEF include the Park Foundation, Ithaca College, and the Park Center for Independent Media. Our major partner is Cinemapolis. Our festival theme this year is entanglements, a concept that explores how different environments, ideas, imaginaries, places, politics, practices, registers, and species twist into each other and enmesh. We are very honored to have you here today with us for this music salon we're calling an evening of brass. Before we begin, we kindly ask you to rename yourself with your physical location after your name. And now it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to tonight's moderator, Kristen Schillinger, bassoonist at the School of Music at Ithaca College.
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Let me share my screen. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today, and more happy to share this wonderful evening of brass with the fantastic brass faculty of Ithaca College, including Chris Coletti on trumpet, David Earll, tuba euphonium, Alex Shuhan, French horn, Aaron Witek, trumpet. This is the wonderful brass faculty of Ithaca College, and together we're going to present this fantastic evening of brass. I love that this is considered a salon concert. Salons musically were an invitation into the home for music. And indeed, virtually, that's what this is right now, right? A discussion being brought into your home. We hope through this discussion that you can get to know these virtuoso brass players, their music, their artistry, their instruments, all a little bit better, so that when you go hear them this Sunday, 4 p.m. in Ford Hall on the campus of Ithaca College, free by the way, that you'll understand a bit more of what they're doing up there on the stage, and you'll feel like we provided you a personal guide to listening to the concert. So let's dig in. I thought as we're having a theme of entanglements, it was appropriate to start out with a discussion of brass relationships. So I'd like for you to share in the chat, when I talk about brass music or brass instruments, trumpets, trombones, tubas, French horns, what do you think of? What kind of music comes to mind? What kind of atmosphere? Are you inside? Are you outside? Is it loud? Is it soft? Is it romantic? Is it patriotic? What are the different things that come to your mind? To help spark your imagination, I have a few traditional brass tropes to play for you.
Try that share again, Kristen, thanks.
Let's start this over. There we go. Probably familiar to many of you. Here's another one. And finally, I know when I think about brass, immediately I think of Sousa bands marching in the street. I think of my high school marching band experience, and I definitely think of the many movie scores that highlight intense brass experiences. However, brass repertoire and brass music in general is so much more in depth and has so much more to it than the traditional tropes we know. So let's hear just a little snippet of what our virtuosos are up to. Here's a piece our trumpet player Aaron Witek wrote with his own students performing. A touch of Cuban flair from our tuba player, David Earll. A beautiful arrangement from Lily Boulanger with our other trumpet player, Chris Coletti. And of course, fantastic chamber music from our wonderful hornist, Alex Shuhan. In addition to just the breathtaking playing from our brass players here, it also highlights the depth and breadth of music for brass playing and the great soundscape that they can create far beyond and in addition to marching band and Sousa marches and John Williams, right? There's so much more to what they're doing. So let's find out more about what they're doing. All right, so a question I want to know is why do you guys get to be grouped together and have all the fun and I'm left out in the cold as a woodwind faculty, right? I know that strings, they're all grouped together because they're all basically the same thing, just one keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Is it the same with you all? Are you all grouped together because you're all technically the same, you just one keeps getting bigger than the other?
I think that's a good point. And it might even be deeper than that. One thing that's unique about brass instruments and all the instruments out there is that the sound you're hearing in a lot of ways is really the sound of the person playing. A string instrument, you're hearing the sound of the vibrating string. And of course, in a reed instrument, double or single, you're hearing the resonance of that reed, but you're hearing the resonance of our actual lips. And it has its history in that goes us back to biblical times and probably earlier. Actually, we don't really know if the first brass-like instruments where you used your lips to buzz were either cow horns or flutes. We know percussionists were probably the first musicians ever and singers, but this is actually a cow horn. Maybe I could show you this a little bit later. But brass instruments are essentially this with longer tubes. This is actually from a cow, by the way, and I apologize to any vegans out there. I asked for a vegan one; they didn't have any.
So what you're saying is you're all playing cow horns.
Yes.
Essentially, yes.
With extra steps added to the equation.
Can you tell me about the extra steps?
You bet. So I think that Chris mentioned well that the thing that ties us together as a family are vibrating lips. The source of our sound comes from creating a buzz. What makes us unique, each independently, from trumpet, horn, trombone, euphonium, and tuba, is the length of tube that's been attached to that instrument and the apparatus we use to control it. So I'm a tubist. My instrument is the largest by far of the family. It's off screen for the most part for this session. And this instrument in my lap, from start to finish, is 12 feet long before I press any of the buttons down. My counterparts that play trombone and euphonium have a 9-foot long instrument. I know that Alex plays a horn, which is a uniquely long instrument as well, just almost as long as a tuba.
Wow.
Actually, the horn probably is longer by the time, but the tube is not as large, so we don't get the bass sound the same way with the same breadth that you do. But horns actually are as long, if not longer than that. All the instruments, especially I'm playing on a triple horn, and I'm not even sure that I know how long the actual instrument is. I'll for the next time we do this, I'll see if I can't actually measure it all properly that way.
So it's a combination of being the biggest instrument, tuba, makes you the lowest instrument, but also how long and how many curly cues are in all the tubing.
That's a good way to put it.
All right. Well, Chris mentioned the buzz. And I love the fact that you mentioned that you and vocalists are the only ones that you're really creating the sound, because you're right. For me as a bassoonist, my reed creates the sound. That's a beautiful point. And I wonder if you can teach all of us how to buzz.
I think I can. You've probably all done this before, especially as kids. And if you're parents, you've probably tried to get your kids to not do this. But essentially, blowing raspberries is the same as it. Now, with a higher instrument, go ahead and do that, especially if your camera's on. Now, the mouthpiece rim constrains the area that's actually able to vibrate. So this is a trumpet mouthpiece rim. And it resonates a smaller area than if you had a tuba rim. And somebody had mentioned shofar. This is actually a cow horn, so it's from Sweden. Shofar, this is actually a shofar from Israel. And you could see that that's actually one of the key differences is that the shofar, at least this one, has a very, very small, actually as a trumpet player, it's actually too small for my trained lips to use, but this cow horn is about perfect. So, shall we all try? This is going to feel a little strange. If you put your fingers like this, you could decide you're going to simulate tuba or a trumpet and anything in between. Now, if it sounded like anything other than air, you're doing it.
Exactly right.
I think I better stick with bassoon. That's really fantastic. Now that we're all burgeoning brass players here, we're learning how to buzz. I wanted to talk a little bit about what it's needed to succeed in the brass world. I know for me, when I was starting in beginner band, right, all the girls were kind of not told to go to the woodwinds, but we naturally did. All the girls were hanging out in the woodwinds and all the boys were hanging out in the brass and percussion. And I look at our esteemed panel of brass virtuosos and you're all boys. And I wonder, is there a reason I'm so bad at buzzing? Is there something genetic? Do you need to be a boy to excel at brass playing?
I think
the answer is decidedly no, as there are plenty of phenomenal female brass players the world over on all of the instruments in the brass family, absolutely. And some of the most revered players and pedagogues out there are women from all over the world. And I have traditionally, in my studio here at Ithaca College, there are almost always twice as many, 3 times as many, sometimes 4 times as many women in the studio as there are men in the studio. So there's the only thing that you require to play a brass instrument is lips that vibrate the way that you just saw Chris doing, and the ability to blow some air behind those lips. And we are all granted that ability once that slap comes in the beginning and we start the very first breath. We're all capable of becoming brass players at that point on.
That's awesome. So it seems like the field is changing. In what other ways has the field of brass changed over the last 30 or 40 years?
Well, I want to go back to your first question,
please,
Kristen. I think that you touched on a really important topic that I think many professional musicians are working to change in the society around, especially beginning band and beginning orchestra. I think that we're coming to a place as adults that work and travel the world and play our instruments to really continue saying all the time that instruments don't have a gender. It's not like it's an inanimate object. The people are what create the sounds on the instrument. It doesn't matter what person comes to it as long as they want to make the sounds. And I think that eradicating that idea of that tuba is a boy's instrument and that clarinet is a girl's instrument, I think that's a big goal for a lot of us. In fact, as Alex mentioned, my former teacher at the end of my doctoral studies is a phenomenal woman tuba player, leading in the industry across the globe, has a doctorate, teaching at an R1 institution, plays all over the globe. I think it's really important not to jump behind your last question, but I at least wanted to tag in.
No, I love that. I'm so glad you did. What other ways, this is clearly a massive change in the industry. What other changes do you see happening in your field that are exciting? Are there changes in tone or changes in instruments?
Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, there was an even bigger change that happened before any of us were even alive, which is, I think, relates to all this. In ancient Greece, trumpet was used, well, of course, in biblical times, to knock down walls, of course. So in a weapon and to call out in battles. But there was even a sport in ancient Olympic times where there was a leather strap to wrap around the face of the brass player. And then in that strap was the mouthpiece and attached to a very simple, crude trumpet type instrument. And people would be competing on different mountaintops. And whoever blasted and was heard the furthest won. So this was, a weapon, a sportsmanship thing used for hunting, used for battle. And one of the most critical steps in brass history was that it was brought indoors into churches with some of the most magnificent, even to this day, some of the most magnificent written for brass instruments. I mean, I guess not tuba, because tuba didn't exist yet, but by Bach, sorry. Can't blame Bach. Blame the inventors of valves. They thought about it too late. But, like somebody like Bach that just wrote some of the most glorious music ever. And suddenly these instruments that were literally as aggressive as an instrument could be were being played in a religious setting indoors. That, I think, is a trend that we've continued to, and there's been ups and downs, but in most ways, brass players, we can't help but have that, or I shouldn't speak for everyone, that like kind of inner energy that a brass instrument lends itself so well to. But we also want to show the world that it's a very vocal instrument for precisely the reason we mentioned, that you're hearing the sound of that person. So you don't want to just be known for being a shouter. I'm not known as being a shouter, am I?
No, you are not. Most definitely not a shouter.
But I think that's a trend. I mean, the sounds coming out of modern brass player is a lot more delicate tones than I think I expected to hear as a young child, and that might just be me getting old.
That's really interesting. Aaron, I know that you collect trumpets. Chris mentioned how historically trumpets were used as weapons and in battle, he also briefly mentioned the invention of valves. And I was wondering if you could talk about what valves do and what the heck you did before they were invented.
Sure, yeah, definitely. So we primarily played on instruments before valves were invented. And this is in the whole wide world. There was no valves yet. And
I'm sorry to interrupt. What is a valve?
Well, if you were to think about a valve with any piece of equipment, it's the same thing. It's on our instrument, we have these buttons and we push them down and it changes. We have holes in here. I'll show you. It look like that, and it changes the direction of our air and our pretty much the air through different lengths of tubing. So if we were to think all the way back to before these were invented, we had what was ultimately known as, you could say, a bugle. It was a trumpet, could be a horn like Chris was showing earlier, but we didn't have any of these valves. It was just a tube, and you would play based on, yeah, Chris has right there his natural trumpet. Mine's in the basement right now. But we played on instruments like that. And as we go up in the register, the harmonics, the notes that we can play get closer and closer. Alex just showed his horn there, his natural horn. So anyways.
Oh, Dave's sad because there's no natural tuba.
We don't have an ancestor in this category.
Tuba is an unnatural instrument. Sorry.
Dave wasn't born yet when these instruments were around.
So anyways, we push these buttons down and it changes the length of the instrument. And as was what was said earlier, the longer the instrument, the lower the pitch goes. So as we add the valves, you can hear that it's going lower and lower. And you might wonder, well, you only have 3 buttons. Well, we have a thing called the Harmonic Series that lets us go on different pitches, and then we incorporate that valve combination. So and we can keep going up and up. As we go higher, these pitches come closer, and the instrument that Chris has there, the natural trumpet, we would actually, the reason it's so long is to take that Harmonic Series, lower it down so we could play all these high notes. So like on our modern instruments, if I wanted to do that, I'll demonstrate what it sounds like from low to high, how they get bigger. You can hear it gets closer and closer and closer as you go up.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, now that we heard the valve trumpet, Chris, would you mind playing a little bit of the natural? Can you do that?
Sure. So this is something that's similar to the similar key to that last one, but an octave lower. So notice it's the same notes, but they get closer together, lower than the trumpet that Aaron was playing. Now it's sort of an amazing thing. Now this is sort of an aside here, but I can't help but say it. The harmonic series that Aaron brought up is a fascinating phenomenon and is not unique to music. Anyone that's taken Algebra 2 or Calculus remembers that you have to learn and then prove that the harmonic series diverges. Now, this is sort of fascinating as a brass player, right? Now, I know some people are immediately going to tune out here, but notice what it sounds like to your ears when I go higher on the trumpet, playing the harmonic series. It sounds like the notes are getting closer. But what's sort of interesting is that the actual frequencies are not actually getting closer. Our ears are playing tricks. And something that's fascinating about the way humans hear, and this is actually true for volume as well, but for this case, what matters is that pitch is compressed. And it makes it so that we're able to hear a huge range of pitches, really low pitches from the tuba, really high to the trumpet, and higher like birds or anything like that. And otherwise, we'd be hearing such a narrow thing. It'd be very hard to survive in the wild. And what that does for instruments, though, is it means that as you get higher as a brass player and as a singer, it feels like, oh, why can't I just go infinitely high? We've got better trumpets, we've got more valves, we've got stronger lips out there. We've genetically modified maybe one day people to be as high note trumpet players. Why is there a limit? And that's the reason. The harmonic series diverges, and eventually, as you go to the next half step, you will, if you go high enough, and approach an infinitely different difference between the frequencies. You cannot, there's a physical limit to how high you could play on any instrument, but on a brass instrument, And it's all because of the harmonic series, which again, on these natural instruments are the only notes you can play.
I had no idea. And as an aside, the next time I play a wrong note, I'm going to tell my students it was a mistake your ear played on you.
Blame the
They're always that way.
Yes, it was the harmonic
Because the harmonic
series'
series
fault.
diverges.
I played the right note. You heard it wrong.
That's
yeah.
right.
There you go.
So Dave, you've been sitting so lonely down there because there is no natural tuba. And so I wonder if you could talk about why you're left out and why the tuba you're the baby of the group here.
We're by far the youngest member of the brass family. We weren't adopted until the 1820s, which after the natural trumpet had been around since, I don't know, like -400 or something. And in the tuba's case, the reason that we didn't have an ancestor like the trumpet, like the horn, and like the trombone have, is that a really, really low instrument has to be enormous to create a melody. It would have to be twice as long as a tuba for you to hear pitches in a reasonable melodic area. And so what they did instead was create a family of instruments called cornettos and keyed bugles, which are the next step before valves were invented. And they're a really fascinating chapter of brass history based on a really faulty understanding of how acoustics work. Woodwind instruments are the modern bearers of keyed technology. If you look at a clarinet or a bassoon, you'll see all these little moving key silver pieces that move all over the instrument that vent the tube at different places, which allow you to make new notes come out. A brass instrument can't do that, but you can kind of bend the pitches enough with your lips to fake that it's doing it. And so the ancestor of the tuba, if you want to call it as such, was an instrument called the serpent. It was an enormous S-shaped instrument, about probably 7 feet long, that was just wrapped in a unique way, that would play about an octave higher than the tuba plays today. This instrument, actually, Chris mentioned, its first use in music was to bolster the sound of church choirs. Organs weren't really in vogue at the time, especially in the late Renaissance, early Baroque era. And so they brought in these wooden instruments that were wrapped with leather and had a cup-shaped mouthpiece that people would buzz into to amplify and boost up the sounds of low voices in church, which is where the cornetto family became really popular. Later, we developed what were called keyed bugles, which were, if you were to envision a saxophone with a brass mouthpiece attached, that was that chapter of our history. Again, it kind of worked. They were very difficult to play. They're really out of tune, and really fine players could manipulate the instrument to kind of make the facsimile of what a modern valve brass instrument could do. But again, they lacked that finesse. And so in the early 1800s, the first really effective valves were patented and were added to brass instruments. Usually there was just 1 or 2 at first. And then later they added as many. I mean, the first tuba had 5 valves, which everyone thought was too many. And then later they had 3 valves, which was pretty much acceptable for everybody. And then the tuba was like, we really need more valves, and we added back a few more. And now we all have our own setups. And so really up until the 1800s, there was no analog for a modern tuba. It kind of just was born out of necessity. We needed something big, low, and in tune in an orchestra. And that had really been missing, unless you had like 17 basses or 47 bassoons to like make a loud enough sound to bolster an orchestra. Instead, you could just hire 1 tuba. It's much more economical to hire a single tuba player than it is to hire 70 other players to play low. No, you can do other beautiful things, but like,
and Dave is available. He's always available to play.
Yeah.
If anybody's interested,
I'm way cheaper.
Put his number in the chat.
Yeah. And so the tuba was born out of necessity. And I'm very proud of the fact that we were the last instrument to be added to the orchestra. We were the last one that got added in the 1840s, and then no other people have been welcomed since, because the orchestra was finally complete.
Well, there's one possible contender here. But
yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up. Is we've been talking about trumpet and tuba and French horn, but there's actually an entire family of brass instruments outside of this. So would you mind talking about what you just held up, Chris?
Sure. Well, I guess it's still trumpet. It's a piccolo trumpet. I thought you were going to talk about trombone, but we don't need to worry about that.
I'll mention that too.
Well, the piccolo trumpet is sort of an exception to that rule, although it doesn't have a seat in the orchestra. But the piccolo trumpet, once people realized that you weren't limited to the harmonic series that a natural brass instrument has, once you have valves, you can shorten the tube and you can still play a chromatic scale. A chromatic scale are these, that's the quanta of music, right? In the Western music, at least. So this is the shortest it gets. This is about half, it's actually exactly half of a normal trumpet.
Oh, it's just a little baby.
It's just a little baby, and that's actually why it has a fourth valve, because the lowest note is not that low, and so you can't really play that much with it. So I just couldn't help but play devil's advocate there.
So Aaron, another instrument that you guys seem to have the most, I was wondering if you could talk about cornet and the difference there and what its use is.
Sure, I don't have my cornet on me right this second. But I could run and grab one downstairs I have in the basement. But a cornet, a lot of people think is smaller than our B flat trumpet. This is our B flat trumpet. We have a lot of trumpets, but it's actually not smaller. It's tightly wound. And what's different, it has to do with the shape of the tubing, the inside of the tubing. So yeah, Chris has, if you can look at our horns, you can see a comparison of our horns here. And so you can see that the cornet, it looks like it could be smaller, but it's not. What actually it is it has shape to that of the horn that Alex plays, which is a conical instrument versus a cylindrical. So this is cylindrical, meaning that the tube is pretty much one size throughout. As we get to more modern trumpets, it's not as true, but the cornet and the horn play on an instrument that has more of a V-shaped tubing. Alex, would you like to talk about that a little bit?
I'm just going to interrupt really quickly. Kristen, if we stop sharing, we can see these guys a little bigger.
Oh, good. I'm happy to do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So
this is the trumpet, and that is the cornet there that Chris has.
Yeah, and the biggest issue here that we're talking about in the bells is you see on the horn that I've got here how much wider the bell. Oh, it's not working because I've got my background blurred here. Sorry about that, but that's why it's acting weird. But the flare on the bell and the tuba also does it as well. But the flare affects the quality of the sound, the quality of the tone, and so that's one of the primary differences between cornet and trumpet, is that on a very refined level, you can listen to those sounds and say, oh, that's got a slightly different tone color to it when it's a conical instrument, as opposed to a slightly more direct. Choose your words carefully, especially when there are trumpet players online. But it's a direct sound. It's perhaps more piercing that way. It has the potential to be far more direct that way, and that's what makes those instruments appeal. That's what makes that sound so appealing like that. And then when you have conical instruments, there tends to be a broader sense in the way that the sound emanates. So instead of going da, you get this kind of a sound that way, and you combine all of those things together in a brass section, and you get a really interesting range of tonal colors ultimately when you put them all together that way. So was that fair? Did I say that all right?
I was only offended for like 2% of that.
I'll work harder next time.
I always like to think of the cornet as the soprano tuba, because it really is borrowing from the trends that this instrument laid down when it was first patented.
So
see, this is what goes on all the time.
So Dave, there's a couple other instruments that we've left out so far. I was wondering if you could talk about euphonium, or as I like to call it, tuba junior.
Of course, yeah. So the euphonium, its original name in most languages translates directly to tenor tuba. So it was an instrument that lived between the horn and the tuba's registers in particular, and it resides kind of as the tenor voice of our family. If you think about translating the different instruments that you've seen today into like a voice type, the trumpets and cornets are like the sopranos, the horn represents like the alto voice, the euphonium represents the tenor voice, and the tuba represents the bass voice. The euphonium is pitched often in the key of B flat, and its name translates directly to beautiful sounding one, which is a really well branded instrument name. We really should have thought way better about our instrument names when we were patenting ourselves, because the one that sounds beautiful is the best name to give to an instrument. And so often tuba and euphonium are lumped together in studios and in sections because of our shared tonal qualities. Essentially, a euphonium is in many ways a really small tuba. It's the next member up in our register before you get up to soprano tuba or cornet, as some people might know it. On the other side, we have what's called the baritone, which maybe you've had identity crises as you've seen bands and called euphoniums baritones or vice versa. They'll probably forgive you. But a baritone is much like the trumpet in that relationship. It's a bright, vibrant, forward sort of sound. It's a much narrower bell. It's designed to have a different timbre. And then we have another very close relative who's not part of our display today, although we're excitedly going to be welcoming a new trombonist to our faculty in the fall. The trombone has been kind of left out of discussion since we don't have a representative on this panel. And that instrument has kind of the most unique history of all of the 5 brass instruments that we've discussed. And that instrument has one very, very long extended slide that can be moved from position to position to play different chromatic notes. And it was the first answer to how do we play chromatic scales in the brass family. It happened far, far before we added valves. By about 400 years, it had advanced to this ability. And so that instrument lives in the same register as the euphonium or the tenor tuba. It lives in that middle voice, that tenor voice.
So in a way, you do have an ancestor.
Well, again, we're not tied together. They have their own history. The tuba, again, we were an orphan just waiting to be discovered until nature and necessity brought us to the floor.
Of course, if there was a trombonist here, then they would also argue one of two things. Either trombone has not evolved at all, since essentially it's the same as it's always been, or they would also tell you that it was not necessary for it to evolve either. So, want to present them fairly. And if there are any trombonists out there listening, perhaps they have something to say. But,
it's like sharks.
Exactly right.
Apex predators.
It works.
Trombones. Yeah, very similar line of evolution.
So part of the reason that we're here chatting, and I'm just gonna move on from that. Part of the reason we're here chatting with this wonderful group of faculty and brass musicians is that you have the opportunity to hear them live in concert, free, Sunday at 4 p.m. in Ford Hall on the campus of Ithaca College. This is amazing. I am going to be there front row. I'm pretty psyched. I had a sneak preview at the program, and since you all are here, we're going to give you a sneak preview of the program. I want to start out with Aaron Witek, one of our trumpet players. Aaron, you're playing this really awesome new piece by composer Kevin McKee, and it's called Centennial Horizon. I found it to be lush and romantic and evocative of film scores. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, first of all, what is Centennial Horizon about? And what is your interaction with the piece?
Sure. So Centennial Horizon is a piece by the composer Kevin McKee. And he is a trumpet player that has pretty much taken off as a composer as well. And he writes a lot of music for brass quintet, which is a collection of our 5 brass instruments. Well, 2 trumpets, trombone, horn, and tuba. And actually on the program, we will be playing another piece by Kevin McKee for that instrumentation. And Centennial Horizon is a piece about a town, actually, Centennial. And so it was, I believe it was Kevin's grandparents that lived there. And this piece just really, it's from out west. And when you listen to the piece, it starts off with this gorgeous lyrical melody, that a lyrical section that's nice and beautiful and goes up and down like you could imagine the mountains. And then it gets to a really, really fast, exciting part that takes off. And that's kind of like the water going through, the mountains, and just it's a super exciting piece to listen to. It sounds like movie music, which is something that I would say Kevin's music definitely tends to sound like. And it's a blast to perform. A lot of people like it. A lot of trumpet players have been playing his music lately. So yeah.
Yeah, I can't wait. I know you're playing, and you have such a beautiful, clear, crystalline sound. And I just can't wait to hear you perform this piece. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. So everybody make sure to come and hear movie music from Aaron Witek with Kevin McKee. So in contrast, okay, Alex.
Yeah.
Alex is playing a Nocturne by Strauss.
Yes, and not Ricard, but Ricard's father. And so for any of you who are out there are listening, Richard Strauss's father, Franz Strauss, was a horn player. Actually, he played principal horn, I believe, in Wagner's opera orchestra. And actually, his son, Richard Strauss's first horn concerto was written for Franz that way. And Franz apparently complained that there were too many high B flats in it and that it was too difficult to play. But Franz was also an important pedagogue, and he was a composer himself. He wrote some beautiful melodies, from a time when, this was before movie music, and before his son came along and completely revolutionized the way that all of these instruments were used orchestrally, and changed everything. Richard Strauss's music, every orchestra audition, you pretty much have to know the entire catalog of all of his music for any audition, because it's all so great that way. But anyway, Richard, I know you had asked me before if I would maybe play a little bit of it. It's called his Nocturno is the name of a piece. It's just a very beautiful, beautiful pastoral, serene kind of melody. It does have a middle section of it that gets a little bit more active in it, but primarily it's nocturne. The sun setting. It's a lovely night out. It goes like this. Along those lines. We won't do any more than that there. So
beautiful. I'm so excited to hear this piece. I didn't know Franz Strauss existed. We're all very familiar with Richard Strauss. Even if you don't know you're familiar, I really encourage you all to just type his name into YouTube, because you have heard Richard Strauss's music in umpteen thousand movies and commercials.
Indeed.
Boom, 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 boom. It's everywhere. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
That's Richard Strauss. And of course, Johann Strauss, our wonderful waltz king. You want to sing us a snippet of Johann?
Same movie. Bum, bum.
Right. Yeah, so these are the two Strausses. We all know them. Franz Strauss is an anomaly to me, so I can't wait to be introduced to a third Strauss and add him to my knowledge.
It's a beautiful piece. Beautiful piece.
So in great contrast to both Franz Strauss and to Kevin McKee, Chris Coletti is playing a concerto by Harry James. This is a throwback to the big band era. This is a really spectacular piece written in the 1940s. And because we have two virtuosic trumpet players here on the same concert, which is just unheard of, both playing solo works, it's such an amazing opportunity to hear the stylistic differences in how the trumpet is treated in a 2011 lush romantic film music piece that Aaron Witek is playing in this 1940s big band concerto that Chris Coletti is playing. So Chris, can you talk to us about how this is different?
Yeah, sure. Well, you mentioned it. It's not really a traditional concerto for those of you that know what a concerto is, which is normally a solo instrument in front of typically an orchestra. But this was a trumpet in front of a big band, and it's not really long like a typical concerto, which is nice, for those of you that don't want to sit there for too long. But it does tip its hat off to some classical moments. So it sounds a little bit like Flight of the Bumblebee, right? But it also sounds like some classic jazz trumpet. Harry James was a great jazz trumpet player, and he wrote it for himself. And it's just fantastic. So I couldn't help but program it. It's a nice way to give you a little bit of a taste of what trumpet can do. It's really cool that trumpet and brass in general has, for whatever reason, kind of had a voice in music ever since it's been created. We mentioned the history of it as a weapon, and to this day as a more vocal instrument. But you could, on the radio, if you turn it on, you'll hear brass in hip hop, you'll hear it in funk, I mean, and not just in the background, it's pretty prominent. Obviously, this piccolo trumpet was featured very prominently in the Beatles. And so there's really never been a moment in history where the brass, especially the trumpets, but brass, weren't part of it. And we're really fortunate. And if that doesn't continue, we're going to lose our jobs.
So I have to come back a little bit. In this concerto, it seems like the style of playing is different. The vibrato is different. There's more pitch slides. The technique, the approach to technique is a little different. And I'm wondering if you can just play for us a little bit of
Sure.
The sounds we'll hear from your piece.
Yeah, so I'm also playing a piece by Gershwin, which is a little bit more of it's jazzy, but it's a little bit more of a traditional trumpet sound. And so in the classical style, this is, I think, one of the things that's unique to a classical style is that what makes it sound classical is that there's not a really big range of sound colors. Now, of course, we want to use a lot of sound colors, but if you go too far from it, it just immediately doesn't sound classical, right? So here's that. So the sound doesn't change that much in that, as opposed to
Yeah.
oh, thanks. Yeah, and in a way, you're encouraged to change the sound as much as possible. Jazz singing is this way too. You won't hear someone going in a classical concert. It just wouldn't sound classical. But it's an incredible palette of expressive colors that are all fair game in jazz and a lot of styles. And so this piece sort of now allows you to do that.
That's something that's quite exciting to me, listening to the history of brass. And of course, we started this entire presentation talking about kind of the traditional tropes or assumptions that we bring to the table with brass music. We have this idea of the marching band or the Sousa bands, or of course, John Williams, right? But to hear the wealth of soundscape, the wealth of sound creation that is coming from these instruments. Speaking of sound creation, I saved this for last in terms of you all talking about your pieces. Dave Earll is actually, we're going to experience a premiere. Dave Earll is doing the world premiere of a concerto this weekend in Kentucky, and then immediately coming back and performing it for us here in Ford Hall, Sunday, 4 p.m. for free. So it's pretty, in case you missed that, it's pretty exciting as an audience to get to hear music come to life for the first time, to know that no one has heard these notes before, that you're one of the first, and how you take it in and the emotions you have, you're the first to experience it. So Dave, I'm wondering if you can talk to us about, what are we going to hear? What's the style? What are you doing?
Yeah, so the piece that I'm going to play on the program is a new concerto written for tuba and strings originally, but it'll be adapted for piano in this context. It was written by a former mentor of mine named Stephen Suddeth. He's a trombone player who teaches tuba, euphonium, and trombone as well. Trombone is his primary instrument. And there's a kind of a short story of this piece. He went to a tuba euphonium conference many years ago, 33 years ago, in fact. And when he got to the conference, he saw that there was a discount to attend if you were a composer. And he's like, I've composed things. I have written music in the past. And so he signed up as a composer to attend this conference. unbeknownst to him, you had to have a piece being performed at the conference as a composer, but his friend, who was a tuba player, went with him and paid the student fee, which was significantly higher than the composer fee. And so Steve, in honor of this debt that he owed his friend for grifting his way into a conference, has promised him that he would write him a piece, and he just never wrote it. And so 33 years later, I realized I have a friend, a former student, in fact, who now can play the tuba like a big boy and like a grown-up might be able to. And so I'm going to finish this concerto. And so this 33-year-long process has resulted in this new work, which I'm leaving tomorrow morning to fly down to Kentucky, rehearse for a day, and then premiere the work on Friday in Williamsville, Kentucky. And the work is a 3-movement work. I'm going to play 2 of the movements on Sunday, just to make sure that the program's not super long. The opening movement, and all the movements are tied together by the idea of modality. Steve really enjoys writing in kind of a Debussy-esque way, borrowing from modes and non-traditional scales. And so this piece is actually pretty audience friendly. It's not super aggressive and angular like so much brass music. It's lyrical and direct, and it has a lot of you'll catch little motives of like kind of film-esque or perhaps background music-esque qualities throughout. The first movement is called a processional, and then the third movement is called I'm going to double check so I don't misname it. I've been practicing all 3 movements quite a bit, as you might guess. And the third movement is called fantasy, and it's based on a couple tropes that you might hear when you hear fantasy-style music, like Fantasy on the Dargason or fantasy based on a theme. And so it's a really exciting process to premiere a new work. This is, I think, the 6th or 7th new solo work for tuba that I've premiered in my career. And it's really fun to have it be attached to someone who's so close to me, a former mentor and now a really close friend.
And it's nice to finally have that debt cleared, right?
Yeah. He made sure that not only his friend, but also I said that his debt had been repaid to the tuba society at large.
Well, I'm even more excited now that a piece that took 33 years to make, like now we know it's gotta be good, right?
Yeah. And so my performance in New York will be the 2nd time it's ever been heard by people.
That's amazing. Cool. And I have to assure you, I love this phrase that David said, so I'm going to use it again. Nothing about this concert will be background music-esque. It will all be completely foreground, exciting, engaging music for you to hear.
Very audible. That is one of our primary qualities.
Yes. So we've talked throughout the presentation about how historically, yes, brass instruments have been used as weapons, putting that aside, but we also associate them again with marches and fanfares and celebrations. And not to fear those that are like, but I like that. I like it too. So I'm super happy to see that you're opening the program with a fanfare. Alex, can you tell us about that?
The Fanfare to La Paris is actually by Dukas. It's a really fascinating piece, and we're talking about it. You guys ever played the rest of the music from this? No, I don't know if you know the history of Dukas, but he was not he didn't like a lot of the music that he wrote. In fact, the stories that I've heard is that a lot of the music that he wrote, he destroyed towards the end of his life, and that a lot of music was lost. And this fanfare it's the opening of the opera, and I got to actually play music from it. I'm sorry, not the opera, ballet. It's a ballet. It's not an opera. And music from the ballet, and I got to play it a number of years ago. The music from the ballet with the Rochester Philharmonic, and I was pretty psyched about it. All I've ever played is the opening fanfare over the years. And again, it's short, it's to the point. I don't know, what's it like, 3.5, 4 minutes long, maybe at most. And it does what fanfares do. It announces, and it's exciting, and it's loud, and it's angular, and it's angry, and it's all those things. And I think back in the day, the concert hall was filled with rowdy patrons, and you had to get them to quiet down. So you played something that got their attention. And then it was over. And I know for myself, for as many times as I've played that in my life, and it's a lot, probably of all the music, like of the kinds of repertoire that it is, it's one of the pieces that gets played the most often because it serves that function so well, And in fact, the way that it's published, you can play the entire fanfare, or you can just play the 8 bars of the fanfare, or you can play a 16-bar fanfare, or you can start at letter C and play that part as a fanfare. It were multiple fanfare types. But what I was really excited about was, man, this is going to be so awesome to go in and play this ballet and hear how this gets used. It never happens. It never happens. It's never there. None of the music from the fanfare is ever present in the ballet again. And the ballet is extraordinarily beautiful. It's extraordinarily beautiful music. It was great, but I'm like, where is it? So often we're used to overtures and things like that are components of the collective whole that way. And it just never happened in this piece. I was so shocked when I played it because I had never heard the ballet music before when I did it just a few years ago. And that was actually when we played it there. I think that was where the conductor who was conducting us at that time shared that little business about Dukas having destroyed so much of his work towards the end of his life. And thankfully, this was not one of those things. But and of course, Dukas' music then, because probably one of the most famous excerpts that you have to play there, Kristen, was written by him, right?
Yeah, so this fanfare that they're discussing that's opening the concert Sunday, 4 p.m. Ford Hall, just make
Wait,
sure.
how much does it cost again? How much does it cost again?
Free
Oh, it's free.
So this fanfare that's opening it, all of the brass, they're playing it together, and then each plays a solo piece. And this composer that wrote the fanfare, Paul Dukas, he wrote the best bassoon excerpt ever. Sorry, non-brass interjection here. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which you all know from Disney. Bum,
Right.
bum, ba 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 bum, ba bum, ba 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 bum, ba bum. Same composer. So you can keep an ear out and see if maybe they break into Sorcerer's Apprentice, or maybe I jump on stage. So before we yield to questions, I also want to just take a moment and say that they're also closing the concert. They'll play this wonderful fanfare all together. Then they'll each play a solo piece, and then they're going to come back together and play a brass piece again by the same composer that Aaron played his solo piece, Kevin McKee. So Aaron, would you mind telling us just a little bit, very short snippet about this brass piece?
Sure. The piece was composed in 2007 when Kevin was playing in a graduate brass quintet at the University of Maryland. And so that's right towards the end of his master's degree is when he composed this piece. It's also in a cinematic style. And it depicts like a rapid descent down this mountain out west. I think it's Castle Craigs, I think it is. But it's like when a violent storm is coming, and you can
always
tell
about
it's
violence
fast.
with us.
Pardon?
It's always about violence with us.
If you're not weapons, it's aggressive and violent.
We're pretty heroic instruments and all, so it fits us. But yeah, it's just a super exciting, fast-paced piece that should be a blast to listen to, and it's a blast to play.
Fabulous. It'll be a wonderful... Oh, please.
I should mention something important about... So we talked about the brass quintet earlier, and we talked about the trombone, our compatriot who's not present today. As I mentioned, we're searching for a new trombone professor to join our faculty for the long term, for the hall, to be a part of this experience. But for this concert on Sunday, we decided that it would be really exciting and fun and vibrant for us to feature one of our recent alumni on the program. So the trombonist for our version of the faculty quintet this year is going to be our recent IC alum, Kurt Ida, who just graduated out of our former colleague, Dr. Hal Reynolds' studio. He's coming back going to play with us for this show. He's actually playing a few other gigs with us in the upcoming weeks and months, and we've been thrilled to welcome him back to the hallowed halls of IC. I wanted to at least give him a quick little plug before we jump onto the questions part.
That's so exciting.
Cool. You know, can I toss one other plug in here?
Please.
Not a plug specifically, but it just, you had asked a question early on, Kristen, about things that have changed, you know, how brass has changed, and then we've quickly morphed into something else. But I think one of the most interesting things that's changed, and you know, I'm gonna say, I'm the old man in this group, and certainly when I was starting out as a player, the group that Chris has now become a member of, or recently left, but still also goes back and visits, which was one of the most important chamber groups in the brass world, the Canadian brass. When I was a kid in high school, Canadian brass, in fact, Chris, when were you? Maybe we shouldn't say when you were born, but I don't know, maybe you weren't even, yeah, you're a child here. But when I was in high school and Canadian brass was just coming on the scene, I was heading towards music school. I thought I was going to have a career as an orchestral player, and I was going to take auditions and do all those things. The idea that you could be a chamber musician and make some sort of living playing a brass instrument in a group of brass instruments was absurd at the time, you know. And then Canadian brass came along, and they were doing it, and frankly, you know, much of my professional career came as a result of the path that they blazed that way. And it's kind of humorous, I think, and I think I can say this now just because it's I've been doing it for long enough. I mean, I started playing in two different groups. I played in a group called the Dallas Brass, and then I did that for 8 years, and I traveled with that group, and we traveled all over the country. We traveled all over the world. We played in fact, we did a couple times where we were in places where we collaborated with Canadian brass back in the day. I think we did some sort of big concert where, it was Empire. I'm sorry, it wasn't Canadian. It was Empire that we did.
No offense.
But we actually crossed paths many times on the road with Canadian. We went and saw them play concerts a couple of times when we were, and you know, back in those days, we Canadian brass had been playing, and man, they'd been around for a long time. We thought that they would retire eventually, and then, you know, we would step into their place, and lo and behold, it's like 50 years later, and they're still doing it, and now Chris is doing it out there as well. But seriously, I think one of the ways that brass has changed over the years is that largely because of groups like Canadian brass, and there were other significant groups as well. There was the American Brass Quintet, the Empire Brass Quintet, and I mean, I think that when I was in both Dallas Brass and Rhythm and Brass, we were a group that incorporated percussion into the group. So we traveled with a drummer as well. I played piano, and now there are other groups that have continued on in that tradition. And so I think that that's been a significant change. And some of that's happened a little bit in your world of the woodwinds as well. You know, there are not maybe not quite as many that have taken over that way, but certainly there are a number of prominent wind chamber ensembles out there, and some of that we have Canadian brass to thank for. A lot of that we have Canadian brass to thank for the work they did that way. So
thank you so much. That's an exciting change in music and wind music for sure. Yep. I could talk to you all night, but I want to leave ample time for questions from our wonderful audience.
Cool.
I'll go first.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Paris. I'm working with Left this year, and I actually was a former woodwind flutist in middle school. So I've no idea about anything brass, and I'm going to this concert on Sunday. So I was just basically asking what is a good thing to think about or prepare for this concert.
Wow.
We tried to design a concert that required no thinking. But if you'd like, but honestly, I mean, we did program stuff that hits such a range of styles And also, as it's been mentioned, you're going to hear us individually, and so different instruments, different styles of composers, pieces, periods of time, the quintet, the fanfare. So you will get a good range of it. But if you Google any of the groups that Alex mentioned, you would get to hear some brass chamber music and give you a sense of like what it could sound like. There's a lot out there, and there's a lot of really fantastic stuff going on.
I think that, you know, the drummer that I work with in my group, Rhythm and Brass, and actually he's a Ithaca College alum, as by the way, his name is David Gluck, and one of my dearest friends, and a brilliant percussionist, also a brilliant composer. And one of the things that I've always really admired about Dave, and I logged many thousands and thousands of hours and miles on the road traveling with him over the years. And Dave was always listening to new music. He was always stretching his palette that way. And I loved one of the things that he always did. He said that anytime he listened to something new, he always forced himself to revisit something at least 3 times before he would dismiss it as being something that he didn't need to listen to ever again. Which I thought was really fascinating, you know, that he would be open enough. So I'm saying that in the spirit for you, if you're coming to something that is new to you, that you come in there with an open mind to what you're, you know, open ears and open mind, and allow yourself to experience something, and maybe come to another concert then. And another one after that before you decide.
At least 3 brass
At least
concerts
3.
in your future. I'll also add that this program is so varied stylistically, and with such wonderful players on everything, that if one piece of music isn't your cup of tea, hang in there, because you're probably going to love the next one. It's a really fantastic concert. Other questions? It looks like Grace has her hand up.
Hi, thank you so much for the great discussion. I have a question for everyone on the panel. I was wondering how you all came to play your respective instruments. Was it your first instrument that you chose and that was it? You stuck with it, or what was your journey with that?
Why don't we go from lowest to highest?
Sure.
I was going to say score order, but we'll go from reserve score. Because Dave,
inverted score order. The
bassoonist.
pyramid, yeah. So the first instrument that I played was the tuba, and the reason I was so drawn to it is that I was a rather tall and large child. I'm still a rather tall and large child. In ways. But what happened in my 4th grade year of middle school is that the middle school band director came to visit our general music class in a different school building. She brought with her like a whole truckload worth of instruments, and she played all of them for us. And then this was many years before pandemics were even on the imagination of the world. She had all of us try a bunch of the instruments, and then she'd wipe out the mouthpiece and we'd go try another one. And I fell so drawn to the biggest things. So my list of things I wanted to play was obviously the tuba. Next was the bari sax, which is the biggest woodwind instrument you can find. And then I was like, if not those, then I guess I'll just play the bass drum. No other drums, just the big one. And so
that's great.
And I fell immediately in love with the tuba. She got me a tuba at school. My parents were both teachers, and so I could either ride the bus home and my parents would beat me home, or I could just wait at school till they were done with work. And so I just sat in the band room every day after school and played the tuba for 45 minutes. And then my parents would tell me it's time to go home, and I went home. And I just fell in love with this very large but incredibly beautiful thing. And what an allegory for life.
And just like you, Dave.
That's awesome. Awesome story, Dave. I started on the piano actually when I was probably 4 or 5 years old, and I still play the piano all these years. And although I'm careful what I play in public. So, when I was we also started instruments in 4th grade where I grew up in New Jersey, and I wanted to play the saxophone, but my parents convinced me that I would have a better chance of getting a college scholarship if I chose the horn. instead of the saxophone. Saxophones were a dime a dozen back then. Maybe they still are. I don't know. But anyway, I think it was kind of humorous that was the argument that they made with me. And I mean, it panned out for me, so it was all right.
Chris, how about you?
Well, I started on violin when I was 4, and then a little embarrassed to admit that I already had the kind of a trumpet player mentality. I told my mom after maybe a couple of weeks that I already knew how to play the violin. I didn't need lessons anymore. And she didn't want to push me into it.
In case anybody wonders what a trumpet player mentality is,
That's it.
that was a great definition.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't need that
very
stuff.
Succinct.
Would you like some sheet music, sir? We don't need any of that stuff. And then when it came to bands, we were actually on a trip, so we came back late. I was technically not allowed into the band, but we went through the tests and stuff. And so they didn't need they didn't need clarinet player, which is what I chose because my grandfather plays clarinet. And the band director at the time had all these tricks for getting people to play what he needed to play. So for those that didn't, if he needed tubas and they didn't have people playing tuba that year, no one signed up, he would have everybody, have thunderous applause for anyone that played tuba that would walk into the room. Everyone looked up to them like heroes. And of course that made it really popular for those years. And for me, he would sometimes hand you, like if you wanted to play clarinet, he'd hand you a clarinet with no reed. And you're sitting there as a 9-year-old, like, no sounds coming out. And then he'd hand you a trumpet. You're a natural. That's how I became a trumpet player.
That's a great story, Chris.
It's true. Yeah.
Aaron, how about you?
For me, it was all a mistake. I didn't know what I was doing.
Yet another allegory for life.
Right.
Evidently, 33 years from now, something will happen.
Yeah, right.
Go ahead, Aaron.
I'm a product of the New York State public schools, and I grew up in Western New York. And so in 3rd grade, you play recorder normally. That's how they introduce you to wind instruments. So I was an awesome recorder player, and then they come around.
Lessons.
No lessons. I could do it one hand. I didn't even need 2 hands to play it. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, so in 3rd grade, they come around and, you get to select like your top 3 instruments. And I wanted to be a drummer, a percussionist. But to me at that time as a drummer, I wanted to play drum set. I wanted to play in a rock band. And I can't remember what I put as second, but I know I put 3rd as cello because I didn't really know any other instruments. My brother played cello. I didn't want to play it, but that's what I just put because you had to put 3 down. So they come to me. I was a pretty tall young man in 3rd grade, and they said, "You're going to play cello," because I could carry the thing. And I went up to the band director as soon as the orchestra teacher left, who is the person that teaches the string instruments. And I said, "I don't want to play in the orchestra." And he's like, "Why not?" I said, "Well, because the band plays all the good music. Like they were playing like these marches and all, and they sounded good." So I didn't want to be like my brother. So he said, "You could play cornet," which we already went over what the cornet is. I thought he said clarinet. I didn't care. I just wanted to play in the band. So I showed up that first day and they handed me a cornet, which looked like a trumpet to me. And yeah, that's how it started.
That's awesome.
That's fantastic. Phil, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I've got a question. It's what really fascinates me is that the horn has been a part of our life for centuries. The idea of the post horn on the stage as it comes into town, the whole idea of taps and military, it's always been a man's instrument, in my opinion. And when Alison Balsam all of a sudden became this incredible woman trumpeter, I went, wow, this is bigger than just that. I'm wondering are there women out there reclaiming it from this whole male world that we've had of like the military and I mean, I love the idea that the post horn was heard as you came into town and it was something that people worked into their music, but that's another subject. And I've got to point out that David had the most amazing woman who was his mentor, New Mexico, sorry,
In Arizona.
in
yeah,
Arizona.
Diana Svoboda.
And so it was wonderful to have her involved, but I'm wondering how women are reclaiming this instrument.
I think
Yeah,
that. Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Chris, you go first, and then we'll hear Dave.
Yeah, I also had a female mentor in my life. I studied with a woman named Lori Frink who passed away, but she was amazing and was even then. I mean, I don't think it was as common, but just had such an influence on so many different trumpet players. And these days, yeah, Alison Balsam. There's another woman named Tina Thing Helseth, and she's incredible. And actually, this is kind of great news. She had stopped touring because she had cancer and just is cancer-free officially as of like last week or something, which is
Nice.
amazing.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm good friends with a lady named Mary Bowden, and she's also created this incredible career as well as a brass group of all female players that's just taking over. I mean, it's great to see, and it's actually more than it's great to see. It's more frustrating that it's been so long that this has taken to happen because it really makes no sense. And it's more of a reflection of our society as a whole. And by the way, I know I keep bringing this up and it seems like I'm changing the subject, but this instrument, when in Sweden, this is from Sweden, this instrument was played by females and it was used to, announce messages to different cow milkers or something. It wasn't.
What was the name of that instrument?
It's a cow, literally cow
It's
horn.
the cow horn. Yeah.
It comes.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I had to. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I wish I could. You know what? Now you bring this up. I have a couple of years ago, I was in Sweden doing training for Suzuki brass training, and the woman, Anne-Marie Sundberg is her name. I think you said you've met her before, right, Chris? Or
Mhm.
and I have a video of her playing she played a bunch of different animal horns there, and it was the most extraordinary thing I've ever heard. But I don't think it would be impossible for me to share it here. It'll take way too long for me to figure it out, but it was just astounding.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that certainly, again, as I had mentioned earlier, in regards to all of this, I mean, there are female horn players and trumpet players, trombone players who have totally taken over the world already. Maybe it's not as obvious, and yes, they're, it's like all the other things in the world that take time to change. We can't erase everything all at once, and things take time, but those things have changed, and there are far more symphony orchestras in this country that have significant numbers of women in the brass sections, and certainly lots of horn sections with plenty of women playing in them, and I'm afraid to even say that maybe there aren't as many in other instruments, but I know that that's not true, and so there are lots of women doing amazing things out there on brass instruments, of all the brass instruments. So,
and I think that this presence of these outstanding women educators and performers is helping to erase a lot of that societal stigma that we talked about at the beginning of this session, right? That for some reason the tuba is a boy's instrument. My teacher's teacher, my grandmother teacher, is a woman named Connie Weldon, who was one of the first major brass pedagogues in the U.S. Taught at Miami, the Frost School of Music, and was a Fulbright scholar who studied in Sweden and studied in Norway for multiple years before becoming an administrator. And I think that the more presence we see that is a reflection of society within our industry, the more it can encourage young people to believe that that option is available to them, regardless of their appearance or their background or what identity they seem to have. I think that we're seeing a further dissolving of that, but it's going to take time for that shift to happen, as it is in many industries. And so I think that these prominent players are really playing an incredibly important role in helping normalize the idea of what it is to be a musician and to be a professional, and like that those words are universally available to any person.
Right.
Thank you. Rachel, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I do. So I know no one here is a trombone player, but that was my instrument, or maybe you are, but that's not like your main instrument. But when I was from age 9 to 13, I did play trombone. And similar with David was saying, I felt that my body reflected the shape of the trombone, and maybe that's why I was so drawn to it. So I just kind of have a trombone question, if anyone might be able to answer it. But compared to the other brass instruments, trombones don't have valves, you know? So I never knew why that was the case. So I was hoping someone here could explain to me why it's so different compared to the other brass instruments with valves. Yeah.
I'd love to. So I'm going to open with my favorite joke that our former trombone professor shared with me the first day he met me. So Hal Reynolds was he was a legacy teacher here at Ithaca College. He passed away just last fall, but he was such a kind and endearing person. And when he met me the first day on my interview at Ithaca College, he noticed that in my job before arriving here, I had been teaching trombone at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. And he asked me in a very pointed way, now, Dave, do you also play the trombone? And I wanted to make sure that he didn't assume that I could. And so I said, oh, no, I only teach the trombone. And he said, so you are the definition of a gentleman. And I looked at him confusedly, and he says, you're someone who knows how to play the trombone, but does not. And it felt like it was a great trombonist joke. And so the question that you asked is, why is the trombone so different than the other brass instruments? And it's that the root of the cause of why it's a brass instrument is that the buzz, right, creates the sound. It has a different evolutionary track than the other members of the brass family. And so their answer to the question of how do I play melodies in the low register was to invent this extension to the instrument that you can move between positions. And that instrument really took hold in Eastern Europe first, and then became much more popular in orchestras as time went on. And so one of its older names I saw float in the chat is the word sackbut, which is an Old English term, which means push-pull, which is, I think, a great description of how a trombone works, right? You push it out and you pull it in. And so this instrument, at the time they used often like grease from animal fat to keep it so it could move, was an instrument that could play a chromatic scale in the low register. It was the only one that could do it really until the early 1800s efficiently. And by the time the rest of our ancestors had caught up to the trombone's ability to play chromatically, they had already figured it out. They were already set. They didn't really need to adopt the valves that all of our predecessor instruments needed to do their job. And so what trombones did do, though, horns have kind of a similar history too. They resisted valves for a very long time. But trombones first started with the slide, and then they realized, man, all the other brass instruments can play way faster than us all of a sudden. And so they added one button that you could operate with their left thumb. This is called, the trombonists call it the trigger, but most modern trombonists can refer to it as the F attachment. And so that button adds essentially one valve worth of tubing to their instrument. It's like playing way out in sixth position, which is almost as far away from your face as you can go. There's one position further. And then later they discovered, man, it would be great to play low like tubas could. And so they added a second button that you can operate with your middle finger of your left hand. That adds even more range to the instrument and gives you more options to play quickly as you work through the different positions and add combinations of valve plus position.
Fascinating. Thank you. Allison.
Yes, hi. So I am a student of the Park School of Communications, but I also play with the Ithaca College Trombone Troupe. I've been playing trombone for 10 years now. And so as a film major, as someone who devotes so much time to stuff like this, to film sets, I am struggling with devoting time to playing trombone. I love playing trombone. I don't want to give it up, but I'm finding myself struggling to keep it as not only a hobby, but to be a part of trombone troupe. Do you have any advice for how to keep up with it, because I can't necessarily play trombone in my apartment. So that kind of thing.
Sure.
about-
Well, one of the things.
Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
No, first of all, since you just said you can't always play in your apartment, there are certainly there are mutes that have been invented that allow for silent practice at various levels, and so that's always a possibility. Thinking long term for you, I think that one of the most fascinating things for me in all the years that I traveled and when I was regularly on the road with both the Dallas Brass and Rhythm and Brass, we would always, at the end of our concerts, we would always go out into the lobby after the program to greet people on the way out. And if I swear to you, if I had a nickel for every time that somebody came up to me and said, I wish that my parents hadn't let me stop playing the clarinet, trombone, piccolo, flute, tuba, everything, every single instrument, because people regret it always in their lives when they stop playing. And so, I mean, I say that only so that you hear it yet again, that it would be really in your interest to find a way not to give it up. I think the most important thing that you can do is for yourself is to try to find some way of building it into your life so that you can't avoid it. You know, I mean, most places that you go, there's going to be a network of, I mean, we have it here in Ithaca. There's a community band here. There's a community orchestra. And in lots of other places you go, you're going to find people who have always stuck towards playing. They may not play on a professional level, but they play on an enjoyment level, you know, and almost any place that you're going to go, nobody's going to turn you away and you say, no, we're not interested in having you play in our group. It's just not going to happen that way.
Thank you so much for that wonderful advice. I want to make sure that I remind everybody about this fantastic opportunity that is happening this Sunday, April 10th at 4 p.m. in Ford Hall on the campus of Ithaca College, where you can hear our fantastic panelists play both in chamber music together, but also as soloists. So I invite you to come join me in the audience. It's going to be a fantastic concert. To close this session, I would like all four of you in 30 seconds or less, and we'll go score order this time, to say why our audience should listen especially hard for your instrument Sunday when they come to the concert, 4 p.m. Ford Hall. Wow. Chris.
Oh, I got thrown off. Score order, it's torn. All right, let's see. I would say that you should listen and see how many different styles the trumpet shines in.
Nice. Aaron.
You should listen to the trumpet because it's the superior of the brass instruments. It's the highest pitch and can do anything. It's the most heroic, yet also can make you cry just because it's so beautiful.
Wow, I don't know that could be beat. Alex.
You should listen to the horn the most because it's the prettiest of them all because of the way that we're wound so beautifully there. And there you go. We do all the same things that the trumpets are capable of, by the way, just with a richer sound.
Ooh. Wow. And Dave.
Should listen for the tuba because everything you were ever told about the tuba before tonight was probably a lie. We, number one, can play fast, slow, high, low, and everywhere in between. One last thing I want to share that's the most important thing about the tuba. We have the widest range of any wind instrument, period. And you'll get to hear a chunk of it at the concert.
Wow.
If those did not convince you to come, I have one more piece of controversial information here. It's that we use a lot of mutes sometimes, and I will be using one mute that you've all probably seen before in your bathroom. It's called the plunger. So I'm not sure if that's going to make you come or not, but I will use it.
And it may, hopefully it's a brand new one, not from your bathroom.
It is used, but I've only used it on my trumpet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So please, again, I hope to see all of you Sunday at 4 p.m. in Ford Hall to experience these wonderful virtuosos live in concert. Thank you to my wonderful panelists for an enjoyable time, and thank you for such an engaging audience.